The grave lay undisturbed for over 1,000 years. Nestled in the quiet soil of Jorko, a windswept island in Sweden's Lake Mälaren, it was one among hundreds, until someone looked closer. This was not an ordinary burial. Inside, archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable signature of a Viking warrior: a sword forged in iron, an axe heavy with wear, 2 shields, 2 warhorses, and a set of gaming pieces that spoke of strategic command. For more than a century, it was cited as the definitive example of a male warrior's grave. Grave BJ 581, heroic, martial male. Except it wasn't. In 2017, science broke the silence. A team from Uppsala and Stockholm universities extracted DNA from the remains. The results shattered a 1,000-year-old assumption. The skeleton carried 2 X chromosomes, and no Y. The warrior of BJ 581 was female. The news rippled through the world like thunder across the fjords. A Viking woman, buried with the emblems of high command? A female warrior, not in sagas or myth, but in the earth itself? This wasn't a token discovery. It was genetic confirmation that a woman, in the late 10th century, held a position of immense military authority. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't ceremonial. This woman was buried like a general. Her grave goods spoke volumes. The presence of gaming pieces, tools used for strategic planning, suggested not only combat experience, but leadership. Warfare was a calculated art, and she had mastered it. Historians had long romanticized shield maidens in Norse poetry and folklore, but until now, many had dismissed them as myth. The woman of BJ 581 changed that. But how did such a mistake endure for so long? The answer lies not in science, but in bias. For over a century, archaeologists looked at weapons and saw a man. They saw what they expected, not what was there. Her bones told the truth, but it took generations for someone to ask the right question. And that question wasn't just, who was she? But why did we assume she was a he? She isn't alone in this misreading. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of Viking graves have been assigned gender based on grave goods, not biology. If this warrior could be female, how many others were mislabeled? Their stories buried under centuries of academic certainty? This revelation wasn't just about one person. It forced a reckoning with the way we interpret the past. It reminded us that history isn't only written in books, it's etched into bone, sealed in DNA, waiting for someone to listen. The story of the Birka warrior is more than a correction. It's a challenge, a call to re-examine what we think we know about gender, power, and identity in the ancient world. She asks us to confront a past we've misunderstood and to ask, at last, what else we've gotten wrong. Deep inside her bones, past the centuries-old silence and beneath the ash of time, her true story was never just about being a warrior. It was locked in her DNA, a biological map, not just of who she was, but where she came from, what she inherited, and what entire histories had forgotten. When scientists extracted her genetic code, they weren't just solving a mystery. They were decoding an epic. Her mitochondria, the ancient engines within her cells, carried secrets passed from mother to daughter over thousands of years. In her case, that signature came stamped with an uncommon name, haplogroup T2b. To most, that's just a scientific label. But to geneticists, it's a whisper from the past. T2b doesn't belong to a single people. It spreads across Old Norse territories, threads through the British Isles, lingers in Iceland. It's a maternal fingerprint shared by women who sailed, fought, traded, and settled. But what made her lineage extraordinary were the mutations, T5774C and C16354T. Subtle changes in her DNA so rare, they don't yet have a proper place in modern classifications. They are biological orphans of history, traces of a woman whose bloodline once pulsed through Viking strongholds, and now exists nowhere else. But hers wasn't the only voice encoded in the ancient genome. Other Viking women, those buried across Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, tell us the same thing. This was not a homogeneous people. This was a genetic tapestry, woven by travel, migration, and conquest. Haplogroups like U, V, I*, and X** appeared in far higher numbers among Viking Age women than in Scandinavians today. Some of those maternal lines, like haplogroup I, are nearly 10 times rarer now than they were during the Viking Age. In modern Europe, they barely register. But in ancient Scandinavia, they were vivid and strong. Women who left behind more than children. They left behind legacies. Even the more familiar haplogroup H, so dominant in today's Europeans, was less common back then among Viking women. This wasn't a world of genetic sameness. It was a dynamic, living story of movement, integration, and maternal influence. And Viking women were at the heart of it. Their DNA carries echoes not just of Scandinavia, but of interactions with Celts, Slavs, Sami, and even peoples from Central Asia. In a burial in Nordland, Norway, one woman carried the rare Sami motif, U5B1B1, suggesting intermarriage or alliance with northern indigenous communities. Another skeleton from central Norway bore haplogroup A*, nearly unheard of in Europe, yet common in regions of Eastern Asia. What does that mean? It means Viking women didn't just belong to Scandinavia, they connected it. Their genetics are evidence of long-distance networks, diplomacy, trade, perhaps even captivity, but ultimately, assimilation and influence. They were bridges, not boundaries. These weren't static mothers in isolated farmsteads. They were mobile, strategic, and adaptive. And they were foundational. Mitochondrial DNA doesn't just record ancestry. It defines biological continuity. While Viking men may have fathered children across the known world, it was the female line that maintained the cultural core. Her voice in DNA is passed on unchanged for generations. This is why every strand matters. Every rare mutation, every lost haplotype. They tell us what was once common, what was cherished, and what history tried, unsuccessfully, to bury. When we say her DNA is unique, it's not just about statistics. It's about legacy. She wasn't part of an anomaly. She was part of a silenced norm. A norm now being unearthed, not by swords or sagas, but by science. And that science tells us. Her line was rare not because she was alone, but because we stopped listening. She wasn't born in Birka. That much we know. The soil beneath her grave couldn't claim her as its own, not by birth at least. When scientists examined the minerals in her teeth, something unexpected surfaced. Strontium isotopes that didn't match the local geology. She had moved, as a child, from somewhere else. But where? That part remains a mystery. A mystery written not in ink, but in bone. Her journey began before she ever held a weapon, before she led men into battle, before she was laid to rest with a sword at her side and strategy pieces beneath her hands. By the age of 9, she had already traveled far from her homeland, not as a settler, not as a captive, as someone who belonged to a world that moved. We think of Viking men as the great wanderers, sailors, raiders, traders. But this woman's body tells a different story. Her migration wasn't an exception. It was part of a larger truth. Viking women moved, not just behind the scenes, not in someone else's wake, but at the forefront of cultural and geographical shifts. Her mobility wasn't just physical. It was social, and it was strategic. When modern scholars analyzed female Viking burials from across Scandinavia, Britain, and the North Atlantic, they began to see patterns. The maternal DNA of these women didn't stay rooted in one place. It reached across islands, fjords, and frontiers. In Iceland, for example, the majority of maternal lineages trace back not to Scandinavian homelands, but to the British and Irish coasts. These women weren't brought to new lands after they were settled. They helped found them. They weren't passengers in the Viking saga. They were architects of it. Some came from Celtic tribes, others from Baltic shores. Some may have been captives who became matriarchs. Others were daughters of alliances, set not to be wives, but to be anchors of influence. Their bones now lie in Viking graves. Their DNA flows through generations, and their stories are only now beginning to surface. One of the most astonishing findings comes from Norwegian burials, where women were found with genetic connections to Central Asia. Haplogroup A*, rare even today in Europe, appears in a Viking-era skeleton in Nord-Trøndelag. That single fragment of DNA suggests a link to regions far beyond Scandinavia, perhaps the steppes, perhaps the Silk Road. How did it arrive there? Through marriage? Through trade? Through conquest? Whatever the route, the outcome was the same. Integration, adaptation, expansion. Even the presence of the Sami motif, U5B1B1, in female Viking remains shows genetic blending with northern indigenous peoples, whose own histories are too often overshadowed. These women moved between worlds, geographically and culturally. They were not homogeneous, and they were never static. Mobility, for them, was not escape. It was strategy. Some likely traveled with war bands, others with trade caravans. Some may have moved under obligation, others by choice. But their genetic traces show one consistent pattern: motion. Across water, across borders, across bloodlines. The woman from Birka was not an isolated case. She was part of a network, an invisible web of female influence that stretched from Scandinavia to Scotland, from Norway to Novgorod. Their journeys weren't random. They were purposeful, tactical, and they left behind more than footprints. They left descendants. In a world that assumed men charted the course of history, it was often women who ensured the journey continued. Their migrations weren't just about distance. They were about connection, about continuity, about survival. And now, when we trace that movement through teeth, through bones, through genomes, we begin to see the shape of a truth too long ignored, that Viking women carried the future on their backs and in their blood. They were always there, on the shores, in the ships, under the banners of clans. But history turned its gaze elsewhere. The myth of the male-dominated Viking Age wasn't born from fact. It was sculpted from silence. For decades, every skeleton laid beside a sword was labeled man. It was an unspoken rule. Weapons meant warriors, and warriors must be male. But that rule was never written by the past. It was imposed by the present. Only when science intervened did the truth start rising from the soil. DNA analysis overturned assumption after assumption. Burial by burial, weapon after weapon, we began to uncover a concealed legion. Viking women who lived not in domestic shadows, but in the crucible of battle and command. The woman in Birka may have opened the door, but she was never alone. Across Scandinavia, Britain, and even the Baltic coast, archaeologists are re-examining old graves through new eyes. Many once considered male solely because of weaponry are now revealing female biology. We had the evidence all along. What we lacked was the willingness to see it. The Norse sagas whispered of shield maidens, fierce women who fought beside men, led raids, and died with swords in hand. For centuries, scholars dismissed them as folklore, poetic exaggerations meant to entertain. But what if they weren't exaggerations? What if those stories weren't metaphor, but memory? What if we had misread the truth, not because it was hidden, but because we refused to believe it? Some graves contain spears, axes, even male armor. Others are far more telling. Strategic objects like full gaming sets and carefully arranged battle gear, not randomly scattered but methodically placed, as if honoring someone of rank. These aren't ceremonial items for display. They're functional tools of war. They suggest knowledge of tactics, leadership, and experience. There's a grave in Denmark, for instance, that holds a skeleton buried with weapons and a horse, long thought to belong to a young male warrior. Recent osteological analysis: female. She was likely under 20, and yet honored with a martial burial rivaling those of seasoned fighters. This pattern repeats again and again. Women buried not quietly, but like champions. The difference is that until recently, we didn't listen. Then there are the graves that offer no weapons but radiate power. Take the Oseberg burial. 2 women laid to rest in one of the most elaborate ship graves ever discovered. No swords, no shields, but tapestries, sleds, exotic goods, and a ship itself. The message: these women wielded a different kind of power, ceremonial, political, perhaps even spiritual. Power didn't always need a blade. And yet, many did carry blades. Many led. Many rode into battle and were buried as warriors, not wives. What we're discovering now is not an outlier, it's a buried norm. One erased by assumptions and only now reassembled through the combined lenses of archaeology, isotopes, and genetics. This isn't about rewriting history, it's about restoring it. And the restoration is changing everything. It's forcing scholars to ask uncomfortable questions. Were Viking gender roles more fluid than previously thought? Did women serve not just as warriors, but as strategists, governors, diplomats? The evidence suggests yes, and in some cases, suggests they did so alongside, and even above, their male counterparts. These weren't exceptions. They were participants in a societal structure far more complex than the male warrior, female homemaker binary. The hidden army of women is only hidden because we chose not to see it. But now, grave by grave, that army rises, revealed not by legends, but by data. They aren't stepping out of fantasy. They're stepping back into focus. And as they return to their rightful place in history, we're forced to face the truth. The Viking Age was never only a man's story. It was always shared by women whose hands gripped hilts, whose minds shaped strategy, and whose legacy still pulses in the ground beneath our feet. Time is a thief, not of memory, but of evidence. Across the graves of ancient Scandinavia, echoes of forgotten lineages lie silent, not because they were never there, but because the modern world no longer carries their signal. In the genetic code of Viking women, researchers once found mitochondrial signatures as bold and frequent as carved runes. Haplogroups like I and X, rare today, were common among female skeletons from the Viking Age. Not anomalies, not background noise. These were central voices in the maternal genome. But somewhere between then and now, they began to fade. Today, haplogroup I appears in less than 1% of modern Europeans. Yet in Viking-era burial sites, it surfaced in over 10% of analyzed remains. Haplogroup X shows a similar story, now a statistical whisper, once a documented presence. This isn't just about numbers. This is about erasure, unintentional, perhaps, but profound. What happened to these maternal lines? Some may have ended with no daughters to pass on their code. Others may have been diluted, merged, outnumbered in generations of movement, war, famine, and assimilation. And some were simply buried in places never found, their stories decaying into the soil. But make no mistake, these women lived. They traveled. They settled. And their blood, once coursing through clans, ships, and homesteads, has left only faint imprints in the gene pool of today. Genetic drift is subtle and relentless. A random shift here, a lost branch there, and over time, entire maternal lines can vanish without leaving a trace. Unlike Y chromosomes, which are studied through male lines with striking stability, mitochondrial DNA is more vulnerable, transferred only from mothers to children, and then only through daughters. That means one broken chain, just one generation without a female heir, can sever a 1,000-year legacy. In this fragility lies the tragedy, because what science now reveals is that Viking women were not only genetic carriers, they were anchors of continuity. Their mtDNA helped shape the cultural and biological fabric of early European societies. Yet their disappearance from today's genetic landscape creates an illusion, as if they never mattered. But they did. Through ancient genomes, we now see that the Viking Age carried a level of female-driven genetic diversity that modern Europe no longer reflects. The richness of maternal lines, connected to distant regions, rare mutations, and isolated haplotypes, offers a window into a world far more interconnected than we imagined. Their presence also forces us to reconsider the selective memory of history. We often remember warriors and kings. But what about the women who birthed their lineages, who stitched together societies through marriage, migration, and diplomacy? The women who anchored settlements, held knowledge, and became silent bridges between tribes? Their DNA has become ghost code, barely detectable in modern analysis, yet once foundational. And the more we learn, the more we realize what we've lost. Not just genes, not just numbers, but stories, movements, names never recorded, lives never sung. Still, some traces remain. In isolated populations, parts of Iceland, coastal Scotland, fragments of Norway, faint echoes of these maternal haplogroups persist. They are flickers of ancient firelight in the genome. Not gone, just almost forgotten. And so, each recovered marker becomes a kind of resurrection, a way to say, we see you now. Because while time may steal the signatures, it cannot erase the impact. These women shaped empires. They spread bloodlines across continents. And though their DNA may be fading, their legacy is written across the bones of Europe. She died over 1,000 years ago, but her legacy is still alive, in the most intimate of places, your cells. Not all inheritance is visible. Not all stories are told in stone or saga. Some pass through generations like breath, silent, enduring, encoded. Today, across Northern Europe, and even as far west as the British Isles, fragments of her DNA still echo in modern populations. In Sweden, nearly 1 in 10 people carry genetic traces linked to Viking ancestry. In parts of the UK, particularly in Scotland and Northern Ireland, those echoes stretch across roughly 6% of the population. But numbers only tell part of the truth. Her legacy isn't measured in percentages. It's measured in presence, in the living continuity of once-buried bloodlines. And what's most astonishing, her line, like so many Viking women, didn't simply follow male conquest. It shaped settlement. It anchored identity. In Iceland, for example, modern genetic studies reveal a striking divide. While the male settlers carried mostly Scandinavian Y chromosome markers, the maternal lines came primarily from Gaelic women, Irish and Scottish lineages that merged with Norse blood. This wasn't a one-sided journey. Women moved, settled, gave birth, and carried traditions. They were not cargo. They were creators. Their mitochondria, passed unchanged from mother to daughter, now form a map. A map not just of migration, but of belonging. And while some haplogroups have dwindled, lost to time, war, or generational gaps, others survive. T2B, U5B1B1, V*I*. These aren't just labels in a lab report. They are the living flame of ancestors who once stood on frozen shores and chose to move forward. Today, when someone in Oslo or Orkney spits into a test tube and sends it off for sequencing, they might unknowingly be rediscovering her. A woman who held a blade, or plotted battle with carved gaming pieces, or crossed oceans on longships to build something new. Science now lets us reverse engineer these legacies. It allows us to hear voices without sound, to feel footsteps that left no fossil trace. Through population genomics, we see that the Viking world was not just raiders and kings. It was networks of women, stitching families into empires. And that's the irony. The stories of men filled the chronicles, but the survival of that world may have always rested in the hands of its women, not just as mothers or wives, but as carriers of lineage, keepers of memory, transmitters of genetic culture. Even today, their influence lingers in ways we rarely recognize. In physical traits, in resilience genes passed down through harsh winters and sea crossings, in the capacity to adapt, to move, to survive, to shape. These women were not legends. They were people, and their contribution to our shared genetic landscape was never marginal. It was foundational. Their DNA may be scattered now, diluted, fragmented, coded across billions of nucleotides, but the impact is still there, rippling through time with quiet persistence. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just think of ships and steel. Think of the women who carried empires inside their cells. Think of a warrior's daughter in a far-off village, or a woman buried with a gaming board who once commanded warriors under northern skies. Because whether we know their names or not, they live in us, in our blood, in our bones, in the stories science is only now beginning to tell.